If you're visiting Switzerland this year, don't miss this video because in it, I'll be sharing tons of tips and must-knows for first-timers. Hi, I'm Christina from happytowonder.com, and Switzerland is honestly one of my favorite countries in the world. I visited a ton of times over the past few years, so through trial and error, I've picked up a lot of different tips and must-knows, and I'm gonna share them all with you today in this video. Let's start with some Switzerland travel planning tips. The first thing that you need to know is that, yes, the rumors are all true. Switzerland is a super expensive country, so make sure you save up and budget accordingly. Now, one of the best ways to save money is by booking accommodation that has a kitchen, whether that's a hostel, an apartment, or a chalet. This is definitely one of the best ways to save money because dining out in Switzerland is super expensive, and if you're able to just go to supermarkets and get groceries, then you can save a ton of money. Another option for saving money is you can opt to stay in villages or small towns which are close to major resorts and attractions. Now, this is obviously a really great option if you don't like crowds and you kind of want to get a bit more off the beaten path. Not only will you save a lot of cash, you're also going to get a more peaceful experience, so in my opinion, that's quite a win-win. And speaking of cash, make sure that cash is in Swiss francs. Yes, Switzerland is not in the EU, so they don't use the euro here, and they have their own currency, which is really colorful and beautiful, just like the rest of the country. In addition to the currency being different, the outlets are also different. So in Switzerland, they tend to use Type J outlets, which look like this. Usually the Type F Euro plugs that you use in most other European countries can fit into these outlets. But one thing to be mindful of is a lot of the time the outlets in Switzerland are gonna look like this. They kind of have like a weird rectangular frame. And so if you have one of those circular adapters, they're not gonna properly fit in there. I've learned that the hard way. So if you're bringing an adapter, make sure it's one that's slim and can actually fit into this kind of frame because you see them a lot in Switzerland. Now, because Switzerland isn't in the EU, another thing that you have to be mindful of is your data plan. So a very great thing for travelers in Europe is that across the EU, roaming is actually free. So if you buy a data plan in France, you can use it in Germany, you can use it in Italy, and it's not a big deal. The only trouble is, as we know, Switzerland is not part of the EU, so they're not included in this free roaming package. And so oftentimes you have to make sure that you're buying a data package that also includes Switzerland. Luckily these days, oftentimes it is an inclusion, but just make sure you read the fine print, because one time I was on a train that wasn't even stopping in Switzerland, it was just passing through, and I loaded like an Instagram photo, and instantly I got a text message from my phone company saying, oh, you're using data roaming, and so this has just cost you X amount, and it was quite a shock. Now, in terms of airports, the major international airports in Switzerland can be found in Geneva, Zurich, and Basel. And a fun fact about the Basel airport, it's one of the few airports in the world that actually is jointly operated by two different countries. So when you're in there, there's actually an exit for France and an exit for Switzerland. I don't think it's a big deal if you accidentally get out in the wrong exit, but I just think it's really fun. Anyways, if you plan to cover a lot of ground when you're in Switzerland, actually what I would recommend if the cost difference isn't too much is to fly into one airport and then fly out of another, or go by train into another country. And the reason for that is just in terms of all the touristy sites in Switzerland, there's not really a super easy route that takes you around a loop and brings you back to the same airport. In my opinion, if you're covering a lot of ground, it makes more sense to kind of go from one end of the country to the other, because Switzerland is small, but still to get from one city in one end to the other, it still takes quite a few hours. So it just makes more sense if you're able to fly into one airport and out the other, then you kind of don't have to double back. Alternatively, if you're not planning on covering a lot of ground when you're in Switzerland, one thing I really recommend is just picking one area and exploring it really thoroughly. And the reason I recommend that is because transportation in Switzerland is super expensive. So really one of the best ways to save money is to just not really travel too far. And I've done this on a few trips. I've picked one destination and I've explored all the different areas around. And this is actually a really fun way to discover more hidden gems and more off the beaten path places, because you're forced to kind of stay within one area. So I really prefer that, but at the same time, I understand if it's your first time in Switzerland and you want to see a lot of the different sites that you've seen on social media, you're going to want to cover a lot of ground. So just know that those are two different options that you can pursue. In terms of when to go, I honestly don't think there's a bad season to visit Switzerland. I've been to Switzerland in all seasons and it's beautiful every single time. In the summer, obviously, you have the hikes and everything. But if I have a tip for you, it's honestly to go during the Christmas season when they have their Christmas markets. I know that Germany is a lot more well known for their Christmas markets, but I did a Switzerland Christmas market trip once, and honestly, the markets there were so diverse and varied, and it was just a really fun and unique experience because you have the traditional markets in Basel and Zurich, and then you can go over to Lausanne where there's all these beautiful modern lights and installations. And then there's the Montreux Christmas Market, which is right along the lake and just such a special location. I really can't praise Swiss markets enough. And I think that a lot of international visitors don't realize that these Swiss Christmas markets are truly amazing. So be sure to look out for those. Now let's move on to some Switzerland travel tips for getting around. Now, if you want to visit some of the beautiful nature spots that you've probably seen on social media, one thing to keep in mind is you probably need to rent a car for that. And the reason is because train travel across Switzerland is indeed super amazing, but the bus services don't tend to drop you off in more remote areas, especially hiking areas. So if you plan on doing a lot of nature, you're probably going to need to rent a car. If you do rent a car though, you do need to purchase something known as vignette. This is pretty much non-negotiable because it's a sticker that you pay for that essentially gives you the right right to use Swiss motorways. Unfortunately, the vignette is only available in annual form, so you're not able to buy one just for a day or for a few days, which is really annoying if you're not spending a lot of time in Switzerland. And the price of this sticker is 40 Swiss francs. Again, it covers you for the whole year, but if you're only there for a few days, that is quite a steep additional cost. On that note, I do think that Swiss trains are some of the best in the world, so I would advise trying to travel by train as much as possible, especially if you're doing a lot of intercity travel. Trains are perfect for that. And if you like train travel, I highly recommend looking into some of the scenic Swiss train rides that they have, because there are some truly incredible rides, some of the prettiest and most scenic in the entire world here in Switzerland, and I have a full article about those. But generally speaking, if you're looking to save money, you can actually do a lot of these scenic train rides just on regional trains. They have the expensive ones that are geared towards tourists that have like the really big glass dome cars and stuff. But if you're interested in just having the experience and seeing the scenery, then most of the time there are trains that are just regular local trains that go along the same routes. So you can appreciate the same landscapes for a fraction of the cost. If you do plan on taking trains in Switzerland, I would heavily consider getting a rail pass of some kind, because trains there are so expensive. There are a few different popular ones, and which one is more ideal for your situation, of course, depends on where you're planning to go and how often you plan to take the train. But here are some of the top options. First off, there's the Swiss half fare card, which costs 120 Swiss francs for the month, but it gives you discounts of up to 50% on all journeys by train, bus, boat, and most mountain railways, as well as public transport in over 90 cities. Of course, it's quite easy to do the math and figure out if this is going to be worth it for you. There's also the Swiss travel pass, which you can buy for different time periods, but this one includes unlimited transport and discounts on attractions. So this one would make more sense if you are doing a very fast-paced trip and you plan on traveling a lot, maybe doing a lot of day trips, and you know you're going to be taking a lot of different trains, then this one would definitely make more sense. And of course, some regions will have their own special pass as well. And this is why I kind of recommended earlier to pick a specific region and get to know it really well, because the regional passes obviously are a lot cheaper than the ones that cover you nationwide. And oftentimes these ones also include entry to different attractions in the area as well, which can save you a lot of money. And of course, if you're traveling to multiple countries during your trip, it might be worthwhile to get a Eurail pass, which is essentially a rail pass that covers you for travel all across Europe. I do have a full review on that, so be sure to give that a watch. I've personally used the Eurail pass in Switzerland and found it to be amazing value, so be sure to look into that as an option as well. Now, last but not least, if you're traveling to Switzerland in the summer, look out for free bike programs. So Switzerland, as we've covered already, is super expensive, but actually a lot of cities will offer free bike rentals if you provide a deposit and usually some form of ID. Now, this is something that's available for locals and visitors alike, so you're definitely eligible even if you're not from Switzerland. And off the top of my head, Zurich and Geneva are both cities that offer this program, so be sure to look into them. All right, now it's time to discuss a few culture and etiquette tips for Switzerland. So the first one is to know that they do speak different languages in different parts of Switzerland. Depending on where you are in the country, you may hear French, you might hear German, you might hear Italian, you might hear Romansh, which is like a very small percentage of the population, but you still might hear it. So be prepared when you do your trip. Be sure to research which languages are spoken in the destinations that you're visiting and plan accordingly. Even though a lot of Swiss people will speak excellent English, it's always a good idea to learn how to say hello and thank you in the local language. Another tip is to not take Swiss directness personally. So the thing is, culturally, Swiss people can come across from a North American perspective as quite cold because they're not as outwardly friendly. They're a lot more direct than we're used to. And so I think a lot of first-time visitors will maybe get the perception that Swiss people are cold and rude, but honestly, that's not the case. It's just a cultural difference. Like for instance, if you walk into a bakery and the person there asks you, oh, what do you want? Instead of, hey, how are you? How's your mom? How's your life? Don't take it personally because it's just, they're very direct. That's just a difference in culture, and don't let it ruin your trip. Now, speaking of cultural differences, Swiss people tend to get up really early, and so that means that shops open earlier and also close earlier. It's actually the norm in Switzerland, especially in smaller towns, for supermarkets to close at 6:30 or 7, which to me is super early. So just be sure to keep that in mind and plan around it. On the note of opening hours, it's actually very interesting. Sometimes in smaller towns, they'll have a really long break for lunch. So just be sure to look up the opening hours for different places before you go, because you shouldn't assume that they're going to be open continuously. And speaking of time, punctuality in Switzerland is incredibly important. So whether you're meeting a friend or you're joining a tour or you're grabbing a train, make sure you get there well in advance. Otherwise, it will probably leave without you or your friend will get mad. Lastly, tipping is definitely not expected in Switzerland to the same extent as North America. Often rounding up is considered enough, and usually it's under 10%. All right, now let's move on to Switzerland tips for attractions. Now, the first tip is to, wherever possible, look into buying sightseeing passes. There are a lot of different passes across the country that bundle up entry for a bunch of different attractions for one set price. And so this can be really good if you're looking into visiting a lot of paid attractions during your stay. From my experience, I've bought a city pass for Lucerne that really saved me a lot of money because there's a lot of really cool attractions in that city that I'd recommend visiting. And in addition to citywide ones, there tend to be regional ones as well that include lots of different attractions in that region. So what I'd recommend is looking looking at which attractions you're interested in and then crunching the numbers and seeing if you'd save money with a pass. Oftentimes, if you're visiting a lot of places in a few days, it is really, really worth it. That said, beware that some attractions and cable cars specifically are owned by private companies. So sometimes these passes that you buy aren't actually good for all the different attractions and cable cars and trains in that one region. I know it can get really confusing. So be sure to read the fine print and see which companies are included and which attractions are included, because sometimes if they're privately owned, they won't be part of the bundle. Another great money-saving tip is to book accommodation where they give you a free guest card. This is one of my favorite things about Switzerland. There's a lot of different areas where if you book an overnight stay of even just one night, they'll give you something called a guest card, which gives you discounts on accommodation and most of the time free local public transport as well. So this is definitely something to take advantage of. Another important tip is to use webcams when you can to check on weather conditions on top of mountains if you're planning on visiting mountain attractions. And the reason for that is even if visibility is fine on the ground level, it might not necessarily be fine 2,000 meters above ground. And so the biggest, most disappointing thing is if you were to get all the way to the top of this mountain and you're not able to see a thing because it's too cloudy. So what a lot of people don't realize is there's actually webcams set up on the top of most Swiss mountains, like the touristy ones, I mean. So what you can do is you can search up the attraction that you're trying to visit plus webcam, and odds are you might be able to find a webcam that shows you the weather conditions from up there. So that way you can kind of plan around it. If you see there's no visibility, then maybe give it a few hours or wait until another day to do it. Now, this is why I'd advise against booking set date tours for mountain attractions until you get closer to the date. So it's really hard to predict the weather in Switzerland, especially if you're visiting in shoulder seasons like spring and autumn. And so I would honestly just wait until a few days before, or even book a flexible ticket so that you can go up when the conditions are actually good, because there's no point in paying all that money just to see nothing. All right, now let's tackle some tips for when you actually arrive in Switzerland. So the first tip is to be mindful of the fact that there's actually an additional tourist tax that you have to pay when you arrive. So yes, I know it's more money and it's quite annoying, but it's not a huge amount. Depending on where you are, it's usually 2 to 7 francs per person per night. So just factor that into your budget. You will have to pay this in person once you arrive. And in terms of safety, I do have to say Switzerland is genuinely one of the safest countries I've ever been to. The biggest menace is honestly the prices and also hiking. So a lot of visitors tend to come to Switzerland expecting to hike, and fair enough, it's a great country to hike in. There's so many beautiful trails, but at the same time, you have to remember a lot of Swiss people grow up hiking and are super used to these trails. And so in my opinion, they're not super tourist friendly because the signage is kind of confusing and it doesn't usually tell you everything you need to know. And so just be prepared for Swiss hikes. Don't assume you can just show up and know instinctively where to go. You should definitely do a lot of research beforehand. Download some apps like AllTrails so that you know where you're going, and also wear proper footwear. These hikes are no joke. They're not super easy, and Swiss mountains can be quite tough for beginners if you're not used to hiking mountains like that. So yeah, don't worry though, if you're not into hiking, usually there's gondolas that can bring you up to the most scenic viewpoints anyway. So no pressure, but if you plan to hike, just make sure you do a lot of research. Now let's talk about food. As I mentioned before, food is probably going to be one of your biggest costs when it comes to Switzerland. And the biggest budget hack that I can really recommend is to do as much shopping as possible in Swiss supermarkets, because even though they're still kind of expensive compared to supermarkets elsewhere, you do save a lot of money compared to dining out. Now, the cheapest supermarkets in Switzerland are actually budget German chains. So they're known as Lidl and Aldi. You've probably encountered them before if you've ever been in Germany. These tend to be the cheapest places to grab groceries in Switzerland. There's also Denner, which is another discounted retailer. That said, if you're not able to find these budget-friendly ones, there can be good deals found at Migros, which is probably the second largest supermarket in Switzerland, and they actually have their own store brand as well, which is really handy. All their store brand stuff is called M Budget, and it's in like green, so it's really easy to identify. So if you're looking for the cheapest ones at Migros, look out for this brand. Lastly, we have to talk about the largest supermarket chain in Switzerland, which is known as Co-op, and it does have the best selection, but it is the most expensive, so keep that in mind. If you do shop there, know that they have their own store brand as well, so look out for that if you're looking for some budget-friendly finds at Co-op. Now, another cheap place to grab food is, I can't say it here, this place, okay? It's actually pronounced S-Bar. And so I know this name seems really questionable, but actually the mission is really noble. Now, this is a chain of cafes that you can find in some Swiss cities now, and basically their mission is to sell day-old food. So they have bakery items like sandwiches and salads and things that use like day-old bread. And honestly, I've had some of their stuff before. It's really cheap and really good and filling. So if you're looking for a budget-friendly bakery to visit while in Switzerland, look out for this. And lastly, if you're doing takeout, definitely look on Uber Eats. I find that Uber Eats often has really great specials. So if you want to do some takeout or delivery, sometimes places will give you like a buy one, get one free deal. So my friend and I, we did this in Basel, and we actually got 2 margarita pizzas for 15 Swiss francs, which is super, super cheap. Of course, I don't think that you should starve yourself the entire time that you're there. There are some Swiss specialties that in my mind are definitely worth the splurge. So some Swiss must-tries include fondue. You've probably heard of it before. It's a delicious pot of melted cheese that you dip, different things in. Sometimes they have a chocolate version as well. There's also raclette, which is an amazing cheese where you melt the top layer and scrape it over top like a bed of potatoes and vegetables. There's also rösti, which is like a crispy potato pancake. So good. And of course, chocolate, which requires zero introduction. Now, in regards to souvenirs, I can actually recommend shopping for souvenirs at the supermarket. I know that sounds lame, but a lot of the things that you'll find in the typical touristy shops can be available at supermarkets for a fraction of the price. So not just things like chocolate, but even things like postcards and magnets, you can usually find in supermarkets, and it's usually way cheaper, so be sure to look out for that. All right, I hope you found that list of Switzerland travel tips helpful. Be sure to let me know in the comments if you have any more questions, and if you want more practical travel videos just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys next week. Bye!